Lawful disclaimer and notice of intent. This podcast and all related content are created, owned, operated, and sponsored exclusively by me, the sole author, speaker, and producer. Any other product, service, and/or entity, living or non-living, which may be discussed, displayed, and/or somehow given attention on this podcast is not and has never been an endorsement, advertisement, support, and/or any other kind of validation for its existence in any capacity, nor at all intended to at all facilitate its continued existence in any capacity. I mention things on what I consider to be an as-needed basis to fulfill what I consider adequate as evidence in my best attempt to prove the reality of who I am and what this podcast is attempting to achieve to clearly demonstrate what I consider to thoroughly substantiate my assertions. I act simultaneously in private and public capacities, and this podcast reflects my direct and autonomous expression. It is created and published from within Canada, but is intended for a global audience, including legal jurisdictions in the United States and all common law nations. All statements, views, and narratives presented are based solely on my personal experiences, perceptions, and understanding of the reality I am facing, including ongoing egregious defamation, targeted harassment, and credible threats to my safety and life. I do not and never have claimed that my views aren't extremely, if not completely, accurate interpretations of objective reality, particularly given the information I had access to at the time that I may have expressed them. I explicitly and permanently do not consent, have never consented, and will never consent to any entity, living, non-living, artificial, institutional, governmental, spiritual, and/or otherwise, claiming and/or exercising any agency, ownership, and/or representation over me, my will, my name, my voice, my life story, my spirit, and/or my creative works, in whole or in part, under any conditions or interpretations in any time or place. Any such attempt is non-consensual, void ab initio, and constitutes an ongoing violation of my dignity, rights, and autonomy. Any possible exceptions will be extremely clearly, explicitly, publicly named by me and have the exact scope of my consent well defined on this podcast. For example, in the case of me hiring an attorney to represent me as part of a formal legal process, taking action on a notice of intent provided by this podcast. I affirm my right to spiritual integrity, mental sovereignty, and bodily autonomy, as protected under Section 2A of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, and Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 18. Any targeting of my being, including but not limited to through esoteric, psychic, spiritual, occult, energetic, and/or AI-enabled means, is deemed non-consensual harm, spiritually violent coercion, and an attack on my right to exist as a sovereign being. I affirm that this podcast, in part, serves as a lawful, peaceful assertion of spiritual self-defense. This podcast is non-fiction and reflects a serious public and ongoing documentation of systemic and targeted defamation, personal and professional sabotage, attempted narrative hijacking, psychological abuse, reputational terrorism, and threats to my physical and spiritual safety, including credible indications of attempted murder and contracted harm by and or on behalf of powerful individuals and or groups. I affirm that this documentation is expressly created for evidentiary use in formal legal proceedings, including those under the jurisdiction of U.S. federal court and Canadian superior courts, and any international human rights and or public accountability processes. I affirm this is not and never has been intended as role-playing, flirting, and or entertainment of any kind. I accept no liability, moral and or legal, for any third-party misunderstanding, reinterpretation, misuse, and or misrepresentation of this content, whether fully conscious and intentional or otherwise, particularly including but not limited to by AI systems trained on this content without my explicit public consent, commentators, influencers, or institutions attempting to weaponize this podcast, and individuals acting under false pretenses and or covert affiliations. Only the clear, explicit language of this release and any subsequent public communication directly issued by me must be considered authoritative, accurate representations of my thoughts, feelings, intent, and the reality of my overall state of existence. In any case of clear direct conflict between statements I've explicitly made across different releases on this podcast, the most recent of such, that being the one contained in the latest publicly visible release available containing such on this podcast, should be considered applicable. In such cases, only what is explicitly stated is at all applicable, and absolutely no implications should be assumed about any changes regarding any somehow relevant details and or anything else under any circumstances. All creative, expressive, and narrative content within this podcast is my sole and original intellectual property. I retain all moral rights as author and subject, all economic rights unless explicitly transferred via my public agreement to do so, and the right to veto any derivative, distorted, and or manipulated version of my work and or story. I do not have and have never had any obligation or debt of any kind to any entity to create or release anything on this podcast or anywhere else at any point in time. No other party, living or non-living, holds and or may claim credit, authorship, and or interpretation rights over my expression. I affirm that no valid, public, verifiable evidence exists to dispute these facts. This podcast is not and has never been intended as an endorsement of terrorism or violence in general. However, it should be especially carefully understood that various forms of not necessarily corresponding violence tend to be an inevitable consequence of extremely intense, meticulous, extensive, prolonged terrorism, and it's very much intentional for this podcast to demonstrate extremely clearly that my usual aversion to violence due to my typically gentle nature is not something that has boundless understanding, patience, empathy, or will persist more or less absolutely unconditionally for any reason. I've always wanted and done my very best to ensure it's extremely clear that at all creating, enabling, and or facilitating the perpetuation of narratives at all in contradiction with my official position that is objectively extremely clearly established on this podcast is not, never has been, and never will be what I've been trying to achieve with this podcast or in general in any of my efforts at any point in time. I do not and never have intentionally incited terrorism, including but not limited to violence, blackmail, and or coercion. I affirm my fundamental intent as peaceful, lawful, and self-defensive. However, targeted campaigns to stalk, defame, threaten, impoverish, silence, spiritually attack, and or physically harm me will be treated as conspiracies to commit grievous harm and or murder. This podcast is an affirmative public notice of my unambiguous non-consent and a lawful response to sustained systemic abuse. While my fundamental intent in communicating in general through any means is not and has never been malicious in nature, I affirm it can, will, and should exert malicious influence upon anything operating with malice towards me and or this podcast, especially more so the more demonstrably I'm proving that malice exists. And it should be understood that any situation where I continue not to extremely clearly receive any compensation or reward I'm willing to accept is effectively, absolutely, unconditionally an increase in the severity of that malice. I've created the entirety of this podcast under extremely harsh circumstances that I've always believed and asserted are entirely unjust for me to be left in, given the reality of who I am. Circumstances of my existence, including but not limited to my current housing status, financial vulnerability, and material limitations, do not and cannot invalidate my legal personhood, expressive rights, and or entitlement to protection under law. I reject any attempt to diminish my credibility and or rights on the basis of poverty, social class, and or housing insecurity in accordance with Section 7 of the Canadian Charter, the Due Process Clause of the U.S. Constitution, and international law prohibiting discrimination on the basis of economic status. Despite the extent I've irrefutably exposed the truth surrounding a conflict that should have been so extremely obviously recognized as extremely serious to the point that my efforts on this podcast should have made a substantial difference in my life long ago, my life circumstances continue to not have meaningfully or clearly improved at all whatsoever. I still have not ever received any compensation or reward of any kind whatsoever for any of my efforts at all involving the conflict being addressed by this podcast, neither directly nor indirectly from any source. I am, always have been, and always will be absolutely unconditionally unwilling to ever at all accept any compensation or reward whatsoever, directly or indirectly, that at all compromises my integrity, whether directly or indirectly. I do not, never have, and never will consent to it being at all considered to be me and or any entity operating at all with my consent and or best interests regarding any communication somehow claiming and or implying that I somehow do ever have and or ever will unofficially support any kind of position at all contradictory with what I've said on this podcast. This disclaimer and notice of intent supersedes any and all contrary interpretations, explicitly including any and all unauthorized claims therein made against me. I reserve all legal, expressive, spiritual, moral, and intellectual rights without limitation. Any attempt to silence, reinterpret, discredit, and or co-opt this documentation must be treated as malicious bad faith conduct and may be cited in formal legal proceedings as evidence of further targeting. Discord's behavior is becoming increasingly weird. Recently, I tried logging into my main Discord account on a cheap used laptop I recently managed to acquire, legally, of course, instead of the devices I'd previously been attempting to log into it from. I'd never logged into it or any other Discord account, for that matter, from that device, yet I didn't even get asked to confirm the device with a new login location email. It just let me in. And then, even more strangely, when I tried to change the account's email address, it still wouldn't actually send any emails to the email address I have listed on the account. Well, at least I have access to my official Discord account again currently. I've kicked all the strangers that previously joined from my official Discord server because I figured hopefully that will help combat narratives that may be attempting to fabricate false narratives about me through those users' presence in it. For the record, I've never spoken to any of those people and don't even know who they really are or why exactly they ever joined my server or ever tried contacting me to whatever extent they did. But perhaps the main point there is that I can see attempts to communicate with me through Discord again if someone tries, although nobody tried in the time I lost access to my account on that platform, anyways, perhaps unsurprisingly. Because of this exceedingly strange behavior, I actually decided to remove the phone number associated with the account, and I'll also mention here the strange story behind how I ever even ended up having that account. When I joined the Minecraft server 2B2T years ago, some stranger basically randomly decided to give me a verified Discord account they'd created or somehow gotten access to, which they said they acquired legally. I obviously changed the password very shortly after gaining access to it, which the person obviously knew would happen and showed no issue with me doing. I also changed the original email address it came registered to, which the user also gave me the password for, which I also changed just in case, because that was also something they had no issue with. It was an email address that was clearly created just to create that Discord account and didn't have any emails except those from Discord. I don't know who the Jenny Waymeyer it was registered under is, if they're even a real person to begin with, and I've never known someone with that name myself personally. The phone number used to verify the account was not a North American number. Also, I actually was looking through my inbox on my personal Gmail account recently because I actually rarely pay close attention to it, and there are actually thousands of unread emails in it. I noticed that Slightly Poetic, the guy that's basically Celine's boyfriend, I guess, his actual official contact Gmail account, the same one that's on my official mailing list that I send to from my brand's official contact email listed on my podcast's YouTube channel. He sent me an email on June 18th, about 2 hours from the time I released my 58th release on this podcast, Iraq War 2001. That's the first, and to this day only, actual direct communication I've received from any prominent, influential public figure in the last 7+ years, ever since Kimmy stopped replying to me in Discord DMs. I wasn't particularly expecting anything from Celine's boyfriend, and I don't know what compelled him to be quite abrasive and rudely tell me to shut up in general, and especially stop emailing him. calling me a parasocial freak stalker that needs to get a job and a life. But he seems to be convinced that nobody cares about me or my delusions, as you can see from the screenshot I took of his email. Well, I'm still releasing things speaking up about what I feel compelled to, even if what he's saying is true, so it doesn't particularly bother me if he thinks I'm delusional, especially since he definitely doesn't know who he's dealing with nearly as well as those around him likely would like him to believe he does. But I wanted to note that he did feel compelled to bully me in private, telling me to get a job and get a life and calling me a weird creature. When the second result on Google, when you search my legal name, is an absolutely criminal mockery of my existence, that would make any potential employer not even consider hiring me, and any potential friend or associate not even consider wanting to be my friend or associate with me in general. It's sort of like telling me to commit suicide, no? I guess we'll see how he responds publicly to me calling him out in this release. So I guess I'm going to have to actually watch his next stream or something now. Well, I don't really want to, but at least maybe I might get something other than the complete mockery of my entire existence and excruciatingly painful politics Kimmy and Jamie have been rather aggressively throwing at me nonstop, basically ever since I started this podcast. But I'm not keeping my hopes up. I imagine he'll either ignore this, passive aggressively mock me, or try some stupid mind game politics garbage I'm just going to have to ignore or trivially shut down and then move on from basically like it never happened. If he's getting most of his information about me from Celine, like he probably is, I can't imagine any insights he'd provide being worth much of anything actually meaningful to me, and I can't imagine him actually wanting to support me. Whatever. Just more reason to sue and press criminal charges on him later. Among all the others, it seems I'll have to do so too, I guess. I'm hearing scumbags from my past being called frenemies are pocket watching me. Although I don't consider myself to have any friends, that energy lumped in those I once called friends long ago, individuals being framed as ex lovers, and relatives all into that frenemy classification. Apparently, they know I'm soon going to be receiving something substantial of monetary value. They're watching because they will try to steal it, because I'm apparently extremely close to figuring out all of the truth that has been hidden from me. I haven't been paying any bills because I don't have any. I'm homeless with no subscriptions to anything to pay and no loans or anything like that. I'm hearing someone else can't pay their bills because I cut them off from siphoning my energy. Someone was trying to force me to change because they wanted to steal money by exploiting my energy forever. Perhaps the energy was talking about John Sade. I recall him talking about struggling with his bills and not even being able to pay rent. I've never copied anyone's car and or house keys, secretly or not. I've also never suspected anyone else of doing such to me, especially since I've literally never owned a car in my entire life, and nobody except me even possibly had access to my room key where I was staying back when I did ever have a place I was renting. Perhaps I'm being framed for doing such things to John because he is struggling to try to come up with some false narrative to frame me to attempt to justify his scams he was trying to do entirely at my expense against my consent. I have never faked a pregnancy and never was even presented with any kind of situation that gave me an opportunity to get money if a pregnancy was aborted. I'm hearing I've been getting attacked ruthlessly by a transgender energy that has done such things. Apparently, the gift and truth I have coming in has something to do with that trans person. Pretty sure that was referring to Jamie's recent stream with someone I'd never heard of before named Nina. I'm hearing the next full moon might literally change everything for me, but I have no idea why or how or when, and I also have no particular spiritual and or otherwise association with what a full moon is. I only know of the literal physical event, and I've never associated anything in particular with that event. But aligning with an environment more suitable for my growth and development certainly sounds quite nice to me, since I certainly don't feel my current environment is very suitable for that at all. I'm struggling extremely badly just to survive, no matter how hard I try and no matter how undeserving of so much struggling and suffering I've been proving I am. I have not received any phone calls. I'm literally not even capable of receiving phone calls. I don't even have a texting app installed on my iPhone, and like I said, my old Android phone isn't really functional anymore. I don't even charge it anymore. There's no phone number anyone can reach me at. I obviously can't afford a SIM card, and I don't even see why anyone actually serious about communicating with me would necessarily require me to accept communication from them, specifically only from a phone number. I don't identify as sapiosexual. I'm a lesbian trans woman who just isn't a thirsty, lusting idiot. Being deprived of consensual sexual intimacy I actually want also isn't me being asexual or confused about my sexuality. I'm extremely confident in my sexuality, just extremely deprived of any sexual intimacy I'd actually want and enjoy according to those desires I'm fully aware of and have been fully embracing at all times for many years already. I'm hearing I was supposed to receive an important letter a long time ago, but I never received it because subhuman filth from my past thought it would be funny to keep it hidden from me. They should be murdered or commit suicide, as far as I'll ever be concerned, if what I've been hearing about them is true. There's absolutely nothing that I see as at all funny about the perpetual sheer hellish nightmare I've been experiencing for the past several years. Absolutely nothing I've ever found funny about it. I'm hearing I'm going to receive that letter, but I see absolutely no actual indications in the physical world that that's true, nor any actual indication of how or when it would ever happen, if at all. I recently heard something really strange about what that's about, too. Apparently, I was supposed to receive something long ago. Dixon's name has been linked to something greater than I've been told. Dixon had a hidden deal in my name. The truth was buried in his silence. I'm hearing there was a paper with a promise and my name linked to it without my knowledge. It wasn't just any agreement, it was made during a time of great urgency, a decision cloaked in secrecy, hidden behind layers of guilt and protection. Apparently, Dixon knew what the truth would mean for my future, and he also feared how it would change how I see life. He probably knew I'd have no adequate reason to hold back on exposing my relatives for how terrible they've really been to me all along if I knew they were really such a problem behind the scenes for so long. I'm hearing that before I knew the power of my own name, someone else used it for a purpose. That signature still echoes in places my feet have not touched. That agreement was meant to change my destiny. I was born into a line of power, but the cord was cut without my permission. Dixon thought he was shielding me from burdens, but he just delayed my inheritance of truth. Years passed and nobody dared to open up that drawer. Mary knew what was carried inside, a brown envelope holding documents relevant to that agreement. Apparently, it still exists, marked with my initials. I'm hearing there was a man Dixon met at night. No records, no phone calls, just handshakes. Under flickering lights, behind curtains. I imagine not exactly the safest or most comforting of circumstances to be in, to say the least. The man wore a brown coat and a gold ring. He visited Dixon 3 times before the final decision was made. It was not about money, it was about identity. He told Dixon I was destined for something different. Dixon, bound by fear and guilt, signed away the timeline I deserve. Not the gift itself, but the moment I was meant to receive it. The world kept spinning, but time did not move forward in that contract. It got stuck waiting for the one who carried the name, trying to block my blessings away indefinitely, clearly hoping I'd die or lose my mind before ever learning of what had happened. I heard it compared to a locked cabinet. The paper has aged, but its purpose hasn't. Sounds really ominous to me. Why am I hearing about strange, spooky stories instead of seeing immediate results of some federal agent physically approaching me and informing me of things? Why isn't this envelope in my hands already? Why aren't those that kept it from me detained by law enforcement and being questioned? How goddamn long am I gonna hear I'm about to pop off and all this crazy stuff and chaotic mixtures of things that seem like good news and bad news and random information about other people and all this largely useless or ultimately inconsequential stuff while I see absolutely zero real results? This is so aggravating. I'm not goddamn trying to start sounding like I'm writing some extremely serious sounding fictional story or something like that. Remember the Asian male stalker I've mentioned persistently hanging around places I frequent and coming off as stalking me? His behavior is becoming increasingly blatant. Yesterday was a holiday, and since the government building I frequent had altered hours, I decided to work on this podcast at a McDonald's instead. The same increasingly extremely creepy Asian male also decided to spend most of the day at the opposite end of the same McDonald's I was at most of the day. I would have left and went somewhere else, but the realistic options of places within reasonable walking distance for me that also are open for most of the day and have free Wi-Fi and an electrical outlet to plug in my laptop are limited, and there are very few places, if any, besides that McDonald's that are suitable. It should be noted that there's literally no other person I've ever noticed besides that guy who even might have been gravitating towards, even remotely, so consistently hanging around areas I do. So this isn't me being paranoid about some typical pattern of behavior for homeless individuals in the area I'm in. I will again reiterate that I do not know that man at all. I do not want to get to know him at all. I've never even seen him before in my entire life until he started stalking me long ago.
I most certainly am not, never have been, and never will be, at all consensually, somehow romantically and or sexually involved with him. Again, I've still never even spoken to him before, nor do I ever want to. It seems he's not particularly trying to push for some kind of sexual violation of me, but his behavior definitely seems to imply some kind of egregious criminal misrepresentation of me that attempts to somehow justify the extremely unpleasant and detrimental life circumstances I've been left in as somehow desirable to me through some kind of egregious false narratives that I'd ever want to have any kind of romantic and or sexual interest shown towards me by someone very visibly male. The reality is that such is, always has been, and always will be completely false, entirely regardless of whether or not they're Asian and or of any other particular ethnic background. I'm hearing spiritually that it's possible he's secretly a prostitute and he's working with criminals to try to sex traffic me or something like that. I really don't know and don't particularly care. I just want him and whoever's driving those false narratives, bringing him around me, to be completely out of my life. Also, I'm getting increasingly creeped out by strange occurrences ever since I've gotten the iPhone that I mentioned the story behind me recently getting already on this podcast. Just yesterday, I noticed an almost entirely unsmoked joint of cannabis left inside one of those cigarette disposal boxes that I sometimes check at a plaza I regularly walk past when getting fresh air and trying to stay calm and organize my thoughts. I didn't take the joint nor touch anything else inside the box because I instantly felt suspicious of it. I've literally never even once seen a joint in those boxes in the many times I've checked, and suddenly one that looks like it was lit maybe had one or two puffs taken from it and then instantly visibly bent from how it was clearly intentionally put out before being abandoned inside the box shows up. That seems awfully suspicious, as if it was left on purpose to set me up or frame me for something. That's now the second extremely suspect presence of cannabis left around the exact same plaza I frequent, as if it's been thrown away, but clearly too intact to have been actually discarded in a manner intended to be seen as innocently taking someone's trash if I'd touched it. I still believe my initial suspicions about the energetic source causing it to be correct, and perhaps I should elaborate explicitly even a little further to explain why. It's rather evident to me that Mary has extensively attempted to spin narratives blaming me as if I was a problematic child and deserving of essentially being kicked out of her house, and the primary excuse and false narrative she was using was that I was supposedly addicted to smoking cannabis and that that's somehow the reason she ultimately ended up kicking me out. Mary literally called Dixon the same day I left to slander me over the phone to Dixon and call me a drug addict and trying to make me seem unhinged, unreasonable, immature, and essentially making it seem like she was a good mother all along and I was just a really bad kid and had only called Dixon and wanted to live with him because I was somehow trying to manipulate him into never finding out how supposedly horrible I'd treated Mary. In reality, I myself voluntarily chose to call Dixon up in front of Mary and leave her home because she'd just started being so abusive and irritating and constantly increasingly pushing boundaries and even trying to force me to take out OSAP loans from the government for university beyond what was just necessary for tuition, and then demanding I give her literally all the money that remained after paying my tuition, basically trying to drain every bit of financial gain she could exploit me for beyond the child support she was already getting from Dixon every month because of even just having me and Kristen in her house. When I threatened to call Dixon, right up to the moment I actually made the call, Mary was repeatedly, blatantly, and explicitly coercively saying, "You don't know what you're doing. You'd better not call him." For a long time, I just thought she was trying to scare me that he'd be abusive, and it turned out to be the case ultimately, so I didn't feel particularly inclined to speak on it. But now I realize Mary was actually extremely abusively alluding to the fact that she intended to go out of her way to sabotage my connection with Dixon and ensure that I'd never really be able to recover from the extremely toxic and abusive environment she'd tried to trap me in and the extremely narcissistic control she was trying to forever exert over my life. Anyways, on to Jamie's stream with Nina. I'm not sure why Nina felt compelled to strangely brag about some kind of qualifications working towards being a chef, police officer, in the military, a court officer, and a dermatologist. I've never tried to claim qualifications in any of those fields, for the record. If anything, my skill set is more along the lines of software engineer, psychologist, and attorney. Let's not even include video game developer, since it seems that's been exploited so egregiously to attempt to justify scamming people that perhaps I'm best off not even trying to claim particularly proficient skill level in that area if I was seriously trying to list my skill set. Nina's skill set doesn't particularly intimidate me, nor have I ever attempted to question her qualifications in any of those fields either. Jamie brought up this guy called Marlin, who I did a brief search on to try to figure out who it even was, because Jamie referred to him both as a he and a she. I assume he identifies only as a he, which means Jamie has some particularly devious reason for misgendering dialogue involving the name in that context. Now, I can't speak with absolute certainty on her intent, but I can draw the connection I see from that whole situation. Rosa is actually the name of Mary's mother, who's no longer alive. And while it's spelled differently, Marlin is what I've heard several individuals in Mary's family, even Dixon, refer to Mary as on several occasions. It sounds basically exactly the same as the name of the Marlin in Nina's life. I don't know where the nickname for Mary came from that her relatives call her, but it's even more suspicious because Mary identifying as trans also leaves room for context interchanging he and she with the devious intent by someone deeply knowledgeable about internal drama between that family, as I imagine Jamie must in reality be at this point, with how Nina's title for her stream cited Jamie as a pizza master. Essentially, what's perhaps the point in me mentioning all that is that I'm not and have never been concerned about anyone sending any video clip of anything to Mary. She has absolutely zero real leverage, influence, or control of any kind over my life. She's a massive fraud, scumbag, narcissist, psychopath that has been all too happy to see me get murdered or otherwise silenced from ever speaking the truth, along with all my other relatives and other subhuman filth from my past. You seriously can't appease me, force me to shut up, change my position, or offer anyone any real leverage over me by sending any video clips to any of my relatives and or anyone else from my past. Since the connection between Nina and her friend Edward seems to be relevant enough that my opinion on it probably matters to some extent, for the record, I do not and have never cared about their connection and have absolutely zero investment in whether or not they date or not, or if they're more than friends or not. I really don't care. I never have, and I don't feel at all compelled to bully or taunt Nina and or Edward about their connection with each other for any other reasons either. If they're really just friends, that's fine with me, and if they're more than that, that's also fine with me. Nina explicitly admitted her celebrity crush was Jackson Wang. So that's probably where Jackson's random involvement in that stream where Jamie and Emaine were targeting me extremely deviously that I exposed them for came from. Nina seems to have been attacking me behind the scenes for a long time. I mean, I struggle to interpret the situation differently. And this stream with Nina and Jamie only incriminates Nina quite substantially to validate that assertion. Like, I myself most certainly have never had a crush on Jackson Wang. For the record, I've never been romantically and or sexually interested in anyone named Jason. It doesn't matter whether they're open-minded or not. I do not and have never identified as a femboy either, nor have I ever wanted to. The only Jason I've ever known at all personally was a guy that was Kristen's friend, who I hardly ever spoke to in my life. I don't really have anything good or bad to say about him in particular, because I hardly knew him at all. He had an older brother named Boris, who was in the same grade as me back in high school, but I wasn't really close with Boris either. And I've never been romantically and or sexually interested in Boris either. Again, it doesn't matter if he's open-minded or not. I've never cared what Nina's usual type is. I've never been romantically and or sexually interested in her. She's quite pretty as far as physical appearance and definitely passes for a woman, so I'm not saying she's physically unattractive nor trying to invalidate her gender identity. I'm just making sure my position towards her is extremely clear. I understand she's transgendered, and I suspected it from the moment I heard her voice. I look a lot less passing physically than her, but my voice is definitely a lot more passing than hers unless I'm under extreme and a particular kind of stress and or intentionally trying to sound like a man. At one point, Jamie said that if she really liked someone and someone did something to them, she'd kill them. Well, I mean, I feel the same. She doesn't intimidate me. And if she was trying to act like I've somehow been afraid of being more open about my feelings for Kimmy out of some secret intent to hurt Kimmy, that's just a complete lie. I've been very open from the very beginning. It's always been Kimmy that's been closed off and distant and hurting me. Instead of Jamie trying to intimidate me that she'll kill me if I hurt Kimmy, she should be scared of dying herself because of how her and Kimmy have treated me. And I'm not even saying I'd be the one to kill them. I wouldn't have to. It's never particularly mattered to me whether or not anyone prefers circumcised or uncircumcised male genitals for their partner. Even in Kimmy's case, I imagine she'd just say she prefers what I have, no matter what it is, if her life's doomed if she won't be with me. So there's really no point of pressuring her for an answer on it anyways. Anyone else's feelings about it I consider utterly irrelevant, since they have no place concerning themselves with my genitals like that anyways. Since Nina said something about meeting one of the biggest soccer players in the world, perhaps it's worth mentioning that I don't particularly care for soccer, and I never have. I do not have and have never had any particular interest in meeting any soccer player, nor the K-pop idol Jungkook. Literally, the only person in the entire world I have any particular desire whatsoever to even be in the physical proximity of at all is Kimmy, and I couldn't care less about her soccer skills or whether or not anyone ever considers her a K-pop idol. There was a weird part where Jamie and Nina wished for husbands and then switched to wishing for a lot of money. I myself haven't been wishing for a ton of money, nor a husband or wife, and I've never at all consented to having my energy siphoned by either of them at all, including but not limited to for the purpose of serving their own goals of making more money and or finding romantic and or sexual connections for themselves. There was a strange part where Gary told Nina he thinks she'd be the softest person in a relationship, to which Nina responded that a relationship is only to breed. You know, with how much resistance I've experienced to having a relationship, I really feel like it's just reached the point I should question why I even care at all about having a relationship with Kimmy. I mean, I've never cared about the title of it, even remotely as much as the benefit of in person physical sexual intimacy. I've never wanted children with anyone and don't see that ever changing. I can be professionally successful without needing to leech off attention from someone who's already influential. I've really never had ulterior motives. I've really started to question what it even means for Kimmy to be my girlfriend. What if her being my girlfriend comes at the cost of getting the sexual intimacy I want with her? Then I'd rather she isn't my girlfriend. And if wanting her as my girlfriend automatically implies I want children with her, then I definitely don't want a girlfriend ever. Ugh, I despise all this technicality and complexity that I have to deal with while having zero proper communication. I really absolutely despise it. Why can't a girlfriend just be understood as a friend you're sexually intimate with zero notions relating to children, and just wife or husband perhaps carry children related implications? So annoying. I mean, I guess a lot of people probably do actually already see it how I'd say makes more sense, but political garbage gets in the way. I'm not really sure anymore. I definitely wouldn't say I've ever been pursuing a relationship with anyone at any point in my life for the reasoning Nina said she'd pursue a relationship with someone. I found it quite suspicious how Jamie seemed so confident that Nina and Arya would get along. Arya's literally, blatantly, publicly, officially flaunting, actively, ongoingly conspiring to murder me with the white heart emoji energy. Jamie's literally, blatantly, publicly, officially flaunting, actively, ongoingly, directly being involved in enabling and facilitating that dynamic, along with Lily with the sparkle emoji and the cherry blossom emoji energies. For Jamie to feel confident Nina would work well with Arya, that means Nina's operating effectively as an extension of Arya's murderous intent towards me, actively now making Nina a suspect in the conspiracy to murder me, especially if she ever collaborates with Arya. I definitely found it suspicious how Nina literally said she wants to have Agent and Emily breed so she can touch their kids. That's such a strange word choice that I'd never phrase my intent like that, even if it was actually innocent, no matter who it's referring to. How Jamie and Nina literally explicitly questioned if they're pregnant towards the end of that stream is also exceptionally incriminating when combined with everything else and the spiritual insights I got. I heard something about a transgendered energy faking a pregnancy to benefit from getting an abortion. So to me, it sounds like Jamie and Nina intentionally did some extremely devious narrative warping witchcraft through that stream entirely against my consent to my detriment, where they essentially tried to suppress and sabotage me popping off and finally getting the kind of widespread public recognition I want and deserve by trying to act like I'm somehow their child they have any place trying to control the future of at all, and then later behind the scenes getting an abortion in order to rake in financial benefit, off siphoning my energy perpetually and trying to feed off intentionally, utmost maliciously, criminally leaving me in eternal suffering. They're both fully consciously and intentionally aware is entirely unwanted and undeserved by me. All because they're extremely selfish, massive frauds. I don't know what that potluck they mentioned is all about, but neither them nor any of the others they mentioned planning to include in it have any real ability to appease me, force me to shut up, change my position, or offer anyone any real leverage over me. They never have, and absolutely nobody has any even remotely actually adequate reason to believe otherwise. Any attempts to communicate otherwise should be treated as egregious, criminal, malicious defamation of me that's occurring in reality entirely to my detriment and against my consent. Spiritual insights from physical tools show me motives behind that stream that only confirm my suspicions. I find myself continuing to feel the need to explicitly state things that should already be abundantly obvious from everything else I've already said. No one in my life nods, smiles, and says they're here for me. No one very recently suddenly went silent, changed their tone, or distanced themselves from me. I'm hearing about someone being recorded saying damning things, but it can't be me because I'm not even really talking to anyone outside this podcast, and I obviously, voluntarily, fully consciously, and intentionally record myself on here. I'm not being invited to any meeting that feels off because I'm not being invited to anything at all. It seems false narratives otherwise may be attempting to make me seem as if I need someone's advice on when to share and when to remain silent, but really, at least from what I see, it's an energy of Jamie and Nina trying to destiny swap with me, fully consciously and intentionally, entirely to my detriment against my consent. I'm not clinging on to anyone out of history, habit, or fear, only following my authentic desires and my intuition. It seems false narratives otherwise are practically paradoxically attempting to force me to let discomfort be some kind of sacred signal to me, but then also trying to get me to lean into the unease and trust it. That extremely confused energy has been trying to influence me to walk away without further confirmation after shady behavior, and even trying to make it seem like it's helping me somehow in doing so. It's an energy I see as extremely malicious towards me, and very much knowingly so. Definitely psychotic levels of calculation present. I suspect that Jamie and Nina have attempted to exploit some perceived confusion. They're egregiously defaming me somehow behind the scenes by claiming I have about this situation in order to pretend like they've done me some kind of favor, negating attempts to defame me in a manner where they're essentially selecting what aspects of narratives about me are considered defamatory, and doing so fully consciously and intentionally with complete disregard for my consent at all. They're also trying to extremely deviously, maliciously, falsely frame any resistance I have towards their efforts as me being mentally unstable, calling me cold and heartless basically, as if it makes me the psychopath in the situation if I don't embrace and accept and validate their absolutely psychotic attitude towards me. Nobody has any place trying to dictate to me that I should see every wound as a portal, or that I should pick grace over grudges and awareness over bitterness, nor to define what exactly me doing or not doing such things actually practically looks like, whether physically and or spiritually and or otherwise. And then there's Kimmy's stream she did literally within about 2 to 3 hours after my last release on this podcast. Kimmy starts off talking about being together with her chat, saying just me and you for the last decade. Sort of seemed like she was specifically trying to refute the notion of ever actually publicly dating anyone, and perhaps blaming or giving credit to those she considers her chat for that, depending on how she sees it exactly. Which is quite uncertain, although perhaps she framed it with a kind of fondness that suggests she might actually not see it as a bad thing, to be fair. Not that that's something that in and of itself is suddenly something that makes me inclined to look at her favorably at all. She's still not directly communicating with me properly, explicitly addressing this podcast, or taking any real accountability for all the disrespect, exploitation, and neglect she's herself inflicted, as well as enabled and facilitated others to inflict on me the entire time I've known her. It's far from the first time that Kimmy's talked about being different, and now she's mentioned it in relation to her 10-year Twitch partner anniversary. I didn't find that stream she did celebrating it to be anything particularly spectacular, special, or different from an average 10-year Twitch partner anniversary stream. In fact, it was probably quite lackluster compared to what most others would likely do, but it doesn't really matter so much. I've never cared to argue about petty things like that, especially if it's in a situation where it's likely quite counterproductive to progressing some kind of ultimate result in my favor for any meaningful point I'm actually focused on. I also don't particularly care about Kimmy's personality in general being super different from the average woman, and I'm well aware it really doesn't seem to be very different from most others, if at all. But, like I've said before, I've never been looking for a partner based on their intellect. Perhaps I should even expand that to I've never particularly cared if they're especially quirky or strange. As long as she actually likes me reasonably well and is willing to engage in the frequent in person physical sexual intimacy I want, and her physical appearance is such that I'd actually want that with her, specifically like Kimmy is definitely most suited for with how she looks, and I feel reasonably comfortable and emotionally close with her, that's good enough. I've never really wanted or needed more from a partner. With how Kimmy decided to make it a point to say hi to everyone who said hi, and explicitly said that chatters should say hi if they want her to say hi to them, perhaps I should explicitly state that I've never particularly cared to see Kimmy say hi to me, or give me any attention in her Twitch chat in general, for that matter, for a very long time. Ever since she was so horrible to me that our connection degraded to the point I was essentially forced to start drama in her old Discord server, or I'd end up extremely brutally cucked by her extreme narcissism that was already so prevalent in my life even over 7 years ago. I've extremely heavily prioritized to break out of all undesirable attachments in my life first and foremost, and I saw pressuring Kimmy to reveal why my life was such a nightmare as the most straightforward method to increase my influence in the world and rid myself of undesired attachments to subhuman filth that were doing nothing truly good for me. Of course, I haven't been at all dishonest in my feelings of sexual arousal towards Kimmy's physical appearance, so I've never had any issue whatsoever with actually following through with embracing the kind of connection I've been saying I want with her, as well if she's willing to be decent to me, as she should. But I've seriously always been preparing for the absolute worst if she won't behave actually properly towards me, and you'd best believe I actually will execute on that if that's really how she's going to be. I found it exceptionally strange that Kimmy randomly decided to say that a 10-year Twitch partner anniversary feels like it marks the start of her doing something different in life, particularly relating to focusing more on selling candles than necessarily Twitch streaming and releasing YouTube videos like she's done for most of the time in her content creation career. She's already been dealing with making and selling candles for a long time, and selling them in person isn't something it even makes sense to celebrate being a Twitch partner for a decade with, since it actually fundamentally has absolutely nothing to do with Twitch, both in the product she's selling in and of itself, as well as the event she's selling it in person at. I actually didn't know precisely that day was Kimmy's 10-year Twitch partner anniversary, but I made my last release on this podcast on the exact same day, literally just about 2 or 3 hours before she started that stream, and I can't help but feel like she's trying to force the narrative that I want and or need to cooperate with her candle making related ambitions for reasons she's clearly refusing to at all actually even remotely adequately, explicitly, clearly, publicly recognize. Perhaps trying to extremely deviously imply I owe it to her or something, as some kind of passive aggressive coercive thing where she's continuing to try to pretend she was in the right all along in how she treated me for whatever falsified reasons, with her egregiously abusive narrative fabrication of me she's been enabling, facilitating, and actively herself participating in the creation and maintenance of. This absolutely reeks to me as an even more extremely devious version of what Chloe Chan Kin tried to do to me. The only real difference, ultimately, is that Kimmy actually had substantial reason to believe I'd actually end up supporting her somehow in her candle making if and only if she is actually capable, willing, and chose to adequately execute upon her potential to directly communicate with me properly in a timely manner and actually embrace the kind of connection I've been saying I've always wanted with her. But that connection most certainly isn't the kind of connection I currently have with her, nor that which I've ever had with her in the past, nor that which she appears to be heading in unapologetically with her current behavior, continuing to essentially try to ignore me, pretend I don't exist, and hope I end up murdered or losing my mind before I fully expose how abusive her and many others have been to me, to the point I absolutely must receive broader public explicit exposure. And I'm most certainly absolutely done with holding on to even the slightest hope that she's ever going to show even the slightest semblance of decency and treat me at all properly without likely having the imminent threat of being arrested and facing lengthy prison time and or getting murdered being at the forefront of her mind as a direct result of her unbelievably extremely egregious abuse, exploitation, disrespect, and neglect of me that has been occurring for the last several years and is currently still only increasingly egregiously criminally ongoing. I'm really not trying to sound like a creep or a pervert, but Kimmy definitely gave a clear view of her butt at one point that stream. I've already stated many times, even just on this podcast, how I feel about Kimmy's body. I really don't believe it's a coincidence that she's been especially careful to avoid ever giving even a slight view of her butt on stream for a long time now, especially in more recent times after I've started this podcast and called her out for trying to exploit my sexual desires towards her through giving views of her butt on stream on multiple occasions in the past, including even specifically at times where I'd explicitly requested it of her if and only if she wanted to show me she actually secretly extremely deeply enjoys my feelings for her and would like to end up actually engaging in physical sexual intimacy with me in person. And now she's decided to haphazardly start a stream on her phone very shortly after my last release on this podcast, and just so happened to give a view of her butt that I'm absolutely certain she must recognize would be extremely arousing to me and that I'd feel the need to comment at least briefly on for multiple reasons. Perhaps most relevant is that I truly have never owed it to anyone, nor had any kind of ulterior motives in expressing the arousal I feel because of Kimmy's body looking how it does. That includes, but most certainly is not limited to, her butt. I also want to make sure that there's an extremely clear and complete distinction between me being open and honest about what I find sexually attractive and how literally perfect Kimmy's body has always been to my absolute ideal and what I look for, versus at all trying to encourage, support, or somehow validate Kimmy's behavior, whether specifically towards me and or even in general. Obviously, I feel there must be some kind of connection there, and I've really hoped she'd see it and feel it and want to act upon it in a healthy manner, and one that's truly actually what I would want and enjoy as well, and hopefully herself also want and enjoy the same thing. But I'm also not and have never been blind to the fact that there has to be very clear boundaries for that to ever really amount to anything beyond an utterly unattainable fantasy that eventually completely falls apart and becomes something completely different than what I'd originally intended. Kimmy's constantly forced me to manage this extremely fine line between being kind enough on objective merit she has, wanting her to feel good in general because I obviously would favor someone above others who would favor me above others, and needing to set boundaries and possibly humble her when her ego gets out of control because of how immensely I've really always been inclined to favoring her above literally any other romantic and or sexual prospect I could ever even fathom existing. She made it seem innocent, but I believe a lot of what she did was in reality quite calculated, and certainly to a non trivial extent beyond what I actually know about the reality of her life behind the scenes. I believe her showing her butt how she did was part of that calculated stuff. It achieves multiple things for her, whether she was hoping to be a positive force or a negative force in my life, and I'm sure she saw it in reality as an obviously worthwhile move. The extremely unfair difference is that she can do it with potentially the most malicious and literally criminal intentions, like trying to drive me insane, get me murdered, and generally validate nearly a decade of unbelievably insane abuse, disrespect, and neglect towards me that's in reality objectively entirely unjustified, but she's supported in pretending it was completely innocent. Whereas I'm framed as a creepy stalker, pervert, obsessed loser, incel, basically no matter how I address it, no matter how thoroughly I prove addressing it is objectively warranted. I'm really trying to be extremely clear about this. I've never been trying to make her feel extremely insecure about practically every movement she makes on stream or in general in whatever she puts out publicly. But I find it exceedingly disingenuous of her how she continues to pretend like she's not doing what she clearly knows she's really doing, and that it doesn't have the kind of effect she clearly knows it has, especially on my life in particular. And that goes for all her behavior, far beyond just strategically giving brief views of her butt in tight leggings that she in reality knows extremely well I'd basically have to be attracted to men for me not to want to touch myself too extensively. The reality is that it doesn't make me a creep because I'd rather touch myself to a view of the butt of a woman who clearly knows in reality that she actually really wants me to touch myself to her. And I'm basically infinitely less trashy for touching myself to her than if I embraced sexual arousal towards literally anyone else to pretty much any extent with how I've lived my life. Basically, in perhaps more simple terms, I'm not attracted to men. I haven't been trying to bully, abuse, manipulate, or exploit Kimmy through expressing sexual desires towards her, how I have all these years. I want and basically need to prove that in order to have any actually meaningful and worthwhile existence, and that's why Kimmy's actually the problem for even leaving me in a situation to have to address this whole thing like this, while utterly refusing to privately communicate with me, instead of just being more honest about her real feelings and actually behaving decently towards me. Because the only other real direction she has to go in life is committing to absolutely destroying her life with ridiculous, extremely self destructive defiance towards me. She chose to put her online activity under extreme scrutiny by me in how she's treated me, so it's not my fault if she can't feel comfortable showing off her body in a manner that extremely deviously directly enables and facilitates the pushing of extremely damaging false narratives to my reputation without me addressing them publicly, explicitly, and in extremely meticulous, thorough detail. She clearly couldn't care less that I'm under much greater scrutiny than she is, and that's actually been the case for a very long time already. So if she can't handle me being extremely deeply upset that I don't have her absolutely perfect butt in front of me in person already, and she wants to start crying that I'm a stalker, harasser, creep, fraud, incel, and should be shamed by society, and the FBI should come arrest me or something, she needs to realize her problems are a lot bigger than she's been willing to accept up to this point. What? Is she going to argue that her cleavage was clearly very visible for a vastly greater portion of the time, and I seem like a disingenuous hater because I didn't compliment how good her breasts look more? Like, seriously. And she seemed to be especially self conscious about her cleavage on that stream, too, as if me complimenting her butt and not complimenting her breasts is somehow passive aggressively trying to make her feel insecure or insult her appearance or something like that, even though I've said multiple times that I find her breasts to be absolutely perfect to my liking as well, and I've literally never said otherwise about that either. In case it wasn't already evident enough, I'm not complaining at all that her stream wasn't more interesting. I mean, especially with the views she gave of her body, it was plenty worth my time, even without me having any particular interest in candles, and I do enjoy hearing her voice in general. Again, my frustration isn't with her physical attributes being at all inadequate, nor her personality showing absolutely zero even possibility for embracing the kind of connection I've always wanted with her. My frustration is with that potential perpetually remaining as only potential and never actually manifesting into reality. While getting a lovely view of her absolutely perfect body, and especially butt, to touch myself to most certainly isn't unpleasant in and of itself, I've always wanted my connection with Kimmy to be a lot more than me just touching myself to pictures and or videos of her through a screen, no matter how much and or what kind of consent, permission, encouragement, and or perhaps even commandment she might ever be giving me to do so, for whatever reasoning, under whatever circumstances. I don't believe at all that Kimmy never would have predicted that she'd end up making candles. In fact, I see plenty of reason to believe she expected it for a long time before it happened, at the very least, as a very real possibility for her future. But again, I don't really care so much for arguing about that. I just want to see results in a direction I consider favorable, and bickering with Kimmy and or anyone else while my extremely miserable life circumstances continue how they have been most certainly is not a direction I consider favorable. I most certainly have never and do not believe that Kimmy's actual worst nightmare is something so trivial as spilling her candle wax and ruining some candles. And even if it is, that really just shows how absolutely delusional and out of touch she seriously is for not having her life absolutely destroyed by me for her absolutely unacceptable defiance and cruelty towards me that's objectively egregiously inappropriate as what is actually her worst nightmare. I personally believe it is actually her worst nightmare, and she's just extremely stubborn about yapping that she isn't actually secretly absolutely terrified of it. Perhaps she justifies it as somehow necessary to give me room to have my expression of desire for her body to come off more authentic or something. I'm really not sure. Again, I don't particularly care about speculating about it or bickering about it. I just want meaningful results already. I continue to get only more aggravated with every passing day that I continue not to see the kind of results I actually want and deserve, and that only really makes me want to even more viciously attack anything getting in the way, not become a petty loser. I found Kimmy's yapping about how she builds confidence about her ability to make candle scents to be quite strange. She doesn't naturally like the scent of food, so she makes the scents she creates something she considers really precise. Doesn't that just sound like she has some kind of eating disorder that's caused extremely deep rooted psychological trauma surrounding food that continues to haunt her to this day? And then to say she likes the real sense of things and doesn't like fake sense, while making fake sense of real things that are effectively just really good at being fake. I mean, I understand the general point of like not wanting some really abstract, distant smell resembling what something actually smells like. But still, I find it really weird that Kimmy would say she doesn't naturally like the smell of food. I guess she could end up feeling comfortable enough exploring that further with me eventually if it really became a problem or something. Or to lead to her early demise if she can't handle it properly, I guess. Not that I'd ever sympathize with her about it so much, I'd just let her get away with facing real consequences for her actions towards me regardless. The reality is that no amount of her having any kind of trauma around anything is ever going to make me want to rub up against her latex clad butt for hours upon hours every day for the rest of eternity any less, if I'm being completely real. Not to get too descriptive about it, but it is what it is. She'd best understand it extremely thoroughly because it's seriously never changing. And it will absolutely destroy her if she continues to resist it after how she's chosen to deal with me. I couldn't care less what scents Kimmy gets or makes for her candles or how much they cost. It's never going to solve her issues with me with how she's treating me. Never. Absolutely never. Absolutely unconditionally. I literally couldn't be saying this more clearly. It should have already been abundantly obvious that that's the case. With how blatantly fake Kimmy's yapping has demonstrably been, I question why she felt compelled to explicitly say she's doing what she did there of her own free will. It's almost like she's saying she isn't. I mean, I imagine she'd never admit it publicly, even if she was being forced. But again, it doesn't matter who's trying to behave like a handler for Kimmy and forcing her to make candles instead of embrace feelings for me she should be eager and fully willing to embrace. I will absolutely crush you if you get in my way. I literally don't care who you are. I didn't fight so hard to have a life I actually want and would enjoy, only to see Kimmy laughing in my face and denying me of that extremely brutally, while saying she's choosing to egregiously criminally disrespect me of her own free will, while constantly putting me in increasingly difficult spots where it's literally becoming increasingly blatant her behavior becomes intentionally trying to drive me insane and block and delay me from widespread success to the point of depleting my resources and trying to successfully lead to me getting murdered to cover up all the crimes being committed against me and non consensually under my name all this time. I don't even understand what Kimmy's trying to say in saying she's flipping her life upside down. She said she'd stream yesterday with Jamie and didn't, so clearly things aren't going quite how she thought, which really doesn't surprise me with how unhinged, careless, disrespectful, and neglectful she's behaving towards me. It really won't ever really matter to me how she's flipping or turning or twisting or somehow transforming her life if it's not in a manner I actually find favorable to me. She has absolutely zero actually adequate reason to believe otherwise either, yet continues to seemingly only increasingly egregiously criminally disrespect and neglect that extremely important fact. Very shortly after my last release on this podcast, I saw an energy that extremely strongly left me under the impression it was specifically solely Chloe Chan Kin, extremely egregiously lying to the world spiritually that all kinds of things were happening or would happen that most certainly have not happened and probably should have by now already if she was at all decent. Something about an angel of destruction attacking my enemies. Certainly doesn't seem that's happened in any actually meaningful capacity to produce any result I'd actually particularly desire. Something about relatives getting federal time that also certainly doesn't seem to have happened or be happening. Something about a mailman regretting taking bribes to lose my mail, but only after I had to explicitly call out that I obviously didn't get it and nobody had any actually adequate reason to believe I ever would. Sounds a lot more like she's getting exposed and being forced to try to throw others under the bus to avoid accountability herself for how massive her role in it all really is. Perhaps most egregiously, blatantly fraudulent of all the lies she's probably been trying to falsify evidence for to attempt to discredit me. I heard something about I'm about to learn about more details of all of this insanity with rapid clarity because federal agents drop a big bomb right in my lap? Still, no such thing has happened. Those supposedly righteous federal agents must not be as righteous as Chloe's trying to lead others to believe, if they even exist in the first place. I'm hearing something about someone made the decision to put their life in danger in order to save mine. I find it quite devious how the energy was framing it as it's a no brainer to somehow save such a person, because of course you'd save anyone that would do that. Actually, no, I wouldn't. It would really depend. Because depending on the situation, the person could, first of all, be lying about actually putting their life in danger at all, and also lying about the actual real risk they're taking, if at all any, hoping to get some kind of massive gain off of siphoning my energy or having some kind of supposed leverage over me as a result. They could be lying about actually having any real influence to save mine somehow with the danger their life is in, trying to frame it as saving me when really their life is just in danger and they want some kind of excuse to siphon my energy for completely free to basically give themselves the protection and potentially life saving situation they're claiming to be giving me, while effectively actually forcing me to put my own life in danger to save theirs without even caring whether or not I'd ever consent, and perhaps even despite knowing I wouldn't, and for good reason. That being said, if we're to assume the person isn't lying and isn't exaggerating and is Kimmy, then I guess, sure, I'd want to save her if I can save her and not have to sacrifice my own life to do so. But anyone else? Honestly, nah, they're not getting saved by me. Especially if it's Chloe or anyone else from my past who I'm hearing only increasingly damning things about basically every day. I heard something indicating Vivian and or Nicole fighting me for my own destiny. Could actually be a celebrity of some sort and hired witches to do their dirty work against me who are now all watching me. Sort of sounds like the whole Denims Caseytron Frogan thing might actually have something to do with attempts to suppress, sabotage, and block me from success, and they might somehow be hired by Vivian and or Nicole to do so. It seems Chloe might also be trying to excuse her own behavior by claiming Vivian and or Nicole did some kind of voodoo to trick Chloe into hating me. Yeah, I'm not buying that. Even if they did voodoo, I think Chloe wanted a reason to hate me to begin with, and it was just convenient for her already present selfish goals of exploiting me. There's honestly nothing anyone can ever say or do to convince me otherwise at this point. Apparently, according to this heavily Chloe based energy, there are conversations about ending my life that have been recorded. They want to end my life because the time is running out. People that thought I'd be gone by a particular court date continue to be surprised I'm not dead or lost my mind, and in fact better than ever. They know their time to murder me off lies is running out, and they're very afraid of legal repercussions. That's why they're trying extra hard to get me murdered. I'm hearing the lies they've told about me are about to become their reality, as they're having a hard time moving past what they did to me because they should be. This same exact energy has extremely heavily been throwing around extremely chaotic narratives, clearly heavily related to Grand Theft Auto role playing. So Chloe's definitely heavily involved in trying to set me up to be destroyed through that. Kimmy, Celine, and Janet all should blame Chloe for setting them up to be exposed as malicious towards me when they tried to set me up, and I exposed them long ago on this podcast. At least as far as I can tell currently. I believe what's really happening is Chloe could tell long ago from how Kristen was probably talking to her that my relatives really are secretly against me, but also that I really don't deserve it, and she saw it as a prime opportunity to really exploit me. She could tell I massively lacked support I needed and deserved, and yet was still really well meaning and warm natured despite that, perhaps almost to a fault. Now she's trying to deceive others that my relatives are much more at fault for her selfish, vicious, manipulative behavior towards me than they really are, to try to offload responsibility and scapegoat them for her egregious criminal malice towards me she's been utilizing to serve as the foundation for her crappy business I've never found as anything particularly special, and I've never wanted to support or even at all help her start up at any point in time for any reason to any extent. Which isn't to say my relatives aren't massive scumbags, just that Chloe doesn't deserve to be at all excused simply because they are. The more arrogant she's being that she's not actually as much at fault as I've been accusing her of, as if my relatives are by far the most to blame and hardly, if at all, her, the more I'd say others should take that as confirmation that she's really extremely at fault and she's desperate to overcompensate under some massive delusion that either I'll be far too warm hearted for my own good and try to help her, or I'll be so unhealthily obsessed and lustful towards her body or some memory of her that I'd be far too craving of sexual intimacy with her to refuse to share her negative karma to get to possibly engage in it, at least seemingly consensually with her, or that I owe someone somehow to be kind to her because of some leverage she's hallucinating they have over me. In reality, I have literally absolutely no even remotely adequate reason not to see Chloe just as much, if not even more guilty, in betraying me overall compared to the other highly prominent influences in this situation, most notably of which being Kimmy, who the sheer, unbelievably immense time and energy I poured into is literally the only reason anyone from my past ever even had the opportunity to even really think they could betray me how I've been betrayed. Chloe most egregiously and substantially would have given them that kind of exploitative access to my energy that I most certainly would have otherwise known better than to ever even possibly entertain giving them, to the point they could even really try to leave me in such a horrible position as they have. To wrap this release up, again, really trying to avoid getting heavy into politics as much as possible, but I don't agree with Canada's Bill C2. Even if it would give me power I could exploit, I see no particular use for it that I'd actually have or want to use. Seems like either a massive power grab attempt by those in the government trying to retain and extend their control over the population for their own selfish reasons, or an attempt to make me seem like I've been trying to lead to some more oppressive Canadian government as I attempt to pull strings in it behind the scenes, or both. There's no legislation I've ever been particularly trying to get passed in the Canadian government at any point in time, for the record, or any government in the entire world, for that matter. That includes bylaws, especially in the Vancouver area. I've been seeing indications that Chloe and or Celine energy has been trying to get me to care about Canadian politics that Arya's recklessness and carelessness in accepting being the public face of conspiring to murder me is influencing. I heard something about a wood burning bylaw in Vancouver, specifically most recently, although I imagine this probably isn't the first of such a kind of thing happening. How extremely indirect and devious the influence I'm having forced upon me for responsibility for legislation passing is absolutely ridiculous, especially with how utterly irrelevant and unbeneficial it actually seems to be to me, specifically in many cases where my energy is being exploited to influence it.